There was a calf nobody wanted, and an orc girl with $25, and a rancher who had stopped wanting much of anything since his wife died. And what grew between those three things, slowly, the way pasture grass comes back after a hard winter. There was a calf nobody wanted, a bidder's paddle that stayed down through the whole short silence of the auction block, and an orc girl, 19 years old, and carrying everything she owned in a canvas bag on her shoulder, who raised her hand when no one else would. By the way, wherever in the world you're listening from right now, drop it in the comments. I genuinely love seeing how far these stories travel. Okay, where were we? The girl's name was Marin. She had her mother's broad jaw and her father's green-gray hands, and the particular kind of stillness that belongs to people who have learned that moving too quickly draws attention. She had come to the county auction in the high flatlands of the Northern Territory on a Tuesday, in early October. The sky the color of a tin cup, the wind pulling at the canvas walls of the sale barn. She had $31 to her name. That was the whole of it. $31. A change of clothes, a pair of work boots resoled twice, and a small whetstone wrapped in cloth that had belonged to her grandmother, and which Marin would not have traded for 10 times what she carried. She had not come to buy a calf. She had come because the auction barn sat beside the road she was walking, and a woman at the last town had told her there was sometimes day labor to be had there unloading livestock. She had done that kind of work before. She was good at it. Her hands knew the weight of a hay bale, the temperament of a frightened animal, the particular patience required to move something living from one place to another without making it afraid. The calf came out near the end of the small animal lots, listed in the auctioneer's sheet as Lot 72, a Hereford, cross male, 7 weeks old, but which the bidders in the barn had taken as reason enough to keep their paddles in their laps. The starting bid was set at $40. The auctioneer called it twice, then adjusted down to $25 with a tone of voice that carried no expectation. Marin raised her hand. The man on the gate looked at her the way people in that county looked at orc, folk who appeared without introduction, a slow, flat assessment that started at the tusks and moved down. She met it without flinching. She had been meeting that look her whole life. The calf cost her $25 and left her $6. She named him Soot, for the dark smudge across his nose. The problem of what to do with a calf when you have no land and no shelter presented itself to Marin within approximately 4 minutes of completing the transaction. She was standing in the cold outside the sale barn, Soot's lead rope looped around her wrist, the animal pressing his large warm head against her hip with a kind of blind trust that she did not feel she had yet earned when the rancher found her. His name was Aldrich Voss. He was 44 years old, which is to say he looked 60 in the way that men who work outdoors in the high flatlands tend to look 60 by the time they reach 40, the sun and the wind having done their arithmetic on his face without asking permission. He was not tall. He was built the way fence posts are built, close and dense and sunk in, and he moved across the frozen mud of the sale barnyard with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who had learned long ago. He had a dark jacket that had been washed so many times the color had become a suggestion, and he wore it open despite the cold, and he did not seem to notice the wind. He had been at the auction to look at a breeding pair he ultimately did not buy. He had no particular reason to stop beside an orc girl with a crooked-legged calf. He stopped anyway. He looked at Soot. He looked at the lead rope around Marin's wrist. He looked at the canvas bag on her shoulder and the Riesold boots, and he did his arithmetic the same way she had been doing her own. It was not quite a question, Marin said. I'm working on that. He nodded once, slowly, the way a man nods when an answer confirms what he already expected. Then he said, I have a barn. He said it the way a man offers a thing he considers practical and not particularly generous. The way you might say, I have a wrench, if someone is looking at a loose bolt. No ceremony, no performance of goodwill. She asked what he wanted for it. He said, you can work. I need a second hand through winter. The nearest town is 11 miles. You can have the spare room above the tack room, and 3 meals and a fair wage, and the calf has the south paddock. She studied him the way she always studied an offer, looking for the catch, the seam where generosity folded back and became something else. She had learned to look for that seam. She had learned it at some cost. She said, I'm not looking for charity. He said, I know I'm not offering it. There it was. Plain, declarative, hanging in the cold air between them. She heard the difference. Marin had lived among people who said one thing to her face and meant another for long enough that she had developed an ear for the gap between words and intention. She heard no gap in his. He said, Truck's the gray one. He did not say welcome or pleased to meet you, or you won't regret it. He walked to the truck. She followed, Soot's lead rope still around her wrist, the calf's crooked foreleg making a small, asymmetric sound in the frozen mud. Step, thump, like a clock that kept good time by its own particular measure. The ranch was called Voss Creek for the creek that ran along its eastern boundary, which was almost dry by October, but which Aldrich said ran strong and cold in spring. The house was 2 stories of unpainted timber that had weathered to a silver gray. The barn was older than the house and in better condition. The spare room above the tack room was small and smelled of resin and horse and old leather, and there was a cot with a wool blanket and a window that looked out over the south paddock. And when Marin set her canvas bag down and looked out that window at the flat sky going orange at the edges, she felt something shift in her chest, not happiness. Not yet, but its distant precursor, the lifting of an expectation of worse. She did not think, this is home. She thought, this will do for now. For now was how she moved through the world in those days. There was a portrait on the mantelpiece downstairs, a woman with reddish hair and the kind of steady expression that photographs taken in formal conditions tend to capture, the expression of someone composing themselves for the moment, rather than the expression they wore all day. The frame was clean. The rest of the mantelpiece had the settled dust of a surface that goes long between attention. Aldrich had not said anything about the portrait. Marin had not asked. She understood the way you understand certain things without words, that the woman was the reason the house was still frozen in 1989, her calendar still on the wall in the kitchen, her boots still beside the door, her reading glasses folded on the windowsill above the sink, as if she had just stepped away. 3 years, Marin later learned. Aldrich had been alone in the house for 3 years, managing the ranch with seasonal help, speaking to almost no one beyond necessity, running on the particular fuel of grief that burns very slowly and very hot and does not sputter or go out. It simply reduces everything around it until only the essential framework remains. Marin did not try to warm him. She was not there to warm him, She was there to work. She worked the way she did everything, quietly, thoroughly, without display. She mucked the stalls and mended the fence line on the north quarter and reorganized the feed room so that the 40-pound bags were stacked by expiration date and the tools were hung where they could be reached by a person of average height. She recalibrated the schedule for rotating the cattle through the winter pasture, not because she had been asked to, but because she could see, looking at it, that it had not been adjusted since the herd count changed. When Aldrich noticed, 3 days in, he stopped in the feed-room doorway and looked at what she had done and said, "This is better." She said, "I didn't mean to overstep." He said, "You didn't." That was the whole conversation. But she noticed he did not change anything back. She cooked in the evenings because she was there, and the kitchen was available, and it seemed wasteful to use it only for her own meals. She made things that required no instruction and kept well overnight: bean pots, braised root vegetables, a barley soup she'd learned from her grandmother that used the same dried herbs, regardless of what else went into it, and came out right every time. The first night she left a portion on the back of the stove in a covered pan without comment. He ate it and washed the pan and left it on the rack. On the fourth day he said, "You cook like someone who has fed a lot of people." She said, "I helped raise my brothers. There were 4 of them." He nodded. He did not ask where they were now. She noticed he did not ask, and was grateful. On the 6th day, she came back from the south paddock to find him crouched beside Soot, running his hand along the calf's crooked foreleg, with the careful attention of someone who knows bone and tissue. He looked up when she approached. He said, "The leg won't limit him. The growth plates set straight. The auction vet was right." He paused. "He has good depth in the chest. Good barrel." He just looked like something that was trying. Aldrich looked at Soot. Then he said, "Yes," in the way that a person says a word when it means more than the word contains. The weeks moved in the way that weeks move when there is constant work and regular cold and the rhythm of animals to maintain. Maren learned the name of every head of cattle on the property, 43 Herefords, and a borrowed Angus bull named Persistence, which Aldrich had not named. The previous owner had, but he kept the name because she learned that Aldrich rose at 4:45 every morning, and that the coffee was made by 5, and that he did not speak much before 5:30, and that this was not unfriendliness, but constitution. She learned that he was better with animals than with people, and that he knew this about himself, and that the knowledge sat comfortably on him because he did not consider it a failing. She told him once unprompted, on a Sunday morning when the cold had broken slightly, and they were sitting on the porch steps with coffee because the inside of the house was warm enough to make the outside briefly pleasant. "I've never stayed anywhere long enough to know what my own rhythms are. What I'm like when I'm not adjusting." He said, "What do you think you're like?" She said, "I think I'm quiet, and I think I'm stubborn about small things and not about large ones." He said, "That sounds about right." He said it the way he said most things, without inflection, without performance. She understood it was the closest he came to saying, "I have been watching." November settled in with the particular gray weight of high flat lands, winter clouds sitting low and motionless over the land, like something held down. Soot grew. He grew with the uncomplicated seriousness of a young animal that has not been taught to doubt its own trajectory, an inch in the withers in the first 4 weeks, then another, his chest deepening, his neck thickening. the crooked foreleg becoming less obviously crooked as the rest of him caught up to it, and made it merely a characteristic rather than a flaw. Marin measured him against the fence post every Sunday. She wrote the numbers in a small notebook. She was not certain what she was building toward. She had not come to this county to breed cattle, but the numbers pleased her, and the measuring pleased her. She did not require a destination for a thing to be worth doing. It was in the 4th week, on a Wednesday evening, that Marin told Aldrich about the man she had left. She did not plan to tell him. She had, in fact, spent considerable energy not telling him, the same way she had spent considerable energy not telling anyone for the previous 2 years, moving on, keeping the story behind her where it could not catch up. But the evening was quiet, and the lamp was lit, and he had asked with no particular urgency why she had been walking the road past the auction barn with $31, and the question was so plainly meant, so absent of strategy. His name had been Drevin. He was a man of consequence in the southern counties. Property, connections, a family name that opened doors and closed investigations. He had come to her family settlement when Marin was 16, already the sort of man who understood that orc communities in the southern counties were isolated enough and economically precarious enough that they constituted, for certain kinds of men, a favorable environment for a certain kind of authority. He had presented himself as a benefactor. That was the word her father had used. Benefactor. He had offered her father investment in the settlement's grazing rights, offered the community a liaison to the county council, offered Marin, at 18, a position as his household manager, a respectable arrangement, her father had said. A real opportunity. What it had been was an erasure. Performed slowly enough that she had not understood it, was an erasure until most of her was already gone. He had not needed to raise his voice. He did not need to. He had the county behind him, and the documents, and the money, and the manner of a man who is publicly kind and privately certain that he is owed. And he used those things the way a slow river uses a riverbank, patiently, constantly, until the shape changes without any single moment you can point to and say, there, that was the moment. He had been particularly skilled at using her own people against her, at invoking the settlement's dependency on his goodwill, to ensure that any complaint she might make would feel like a betrayal of her family rather than a protection of herself. She had left on a morning in April, 19 months before the auction. She had taken the whetstone and her work boots and the $31 she had accumulated over months by spending nothing she was given for household expenses and saving the difference $2 at a time in an envelope behind the loose board in the back of the pantry. She had walked out the kitchen door at 4 in the morning, and she had not stopped walking for 19 months, except to work and sleep. Aldrich listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he said, "He knows where you are." She said, "Not yet." The word "yet" landed between them and sat there. He said, "All right." He did not say "I'm sorry," which she appreciated. She did not need "I'm sorry." She needed, I understand, the situation, his "all right" was both. December came. The cold hardened. The creek on the eastern boundary froze to its gravel bed, and the cattle moved slower in the mornings, their breath in the air like small persistent flags. Aldrich had a neighbor to the west, a woman named Helga Brone, who was 68 and had been ranching alone since her husband went into the ground 11 years prior, and who had no patience for unnecessary conversation. She began appearing at Foss Creek with frequency after Marin's arrival. Not to visit, she was quick to clarify, but because she was passing anyway, or because she had extra of something, or because the south fence needed looking at from both sides. She fed Marin fried bread and gave opinions freely, and asked no questions that weren't practical, and Marin loved her for it the way you love a person who treats you like furniture. Not dismissively, but with the comfortable assumption that you belong in the room. A man from town named Rupert Cale began appearing with different frequency and different energy, a county official of some kind, land records, easements, the sort of position that gives a man paper authority over people who own less than he imagines they should. He had the slow vowels and the deliberate geniality of someone who has decided he is liked and has never been sufficiently corrected. He made a point of calling Marin young lady and of speaking to Aldrich in the particular tone that men use when they want to discuss a woman in front of her, as though she is not quite present. Aldrich answered him in monosyllables and did not adjust his tone. Rupert Cale stopped coming around by mid-December. Soot turned 14 weeks old on the 15th of December. Marin wrote it in the notebook. Aldrich looked at the number and said, "He's going to be big." She said, "He already is." Aldrich said, "I mean later." "He's going to be considerably big." She looked at him. He had the expression of a man who has calculated something and is deciding whether to say it. He said, "You should think about the spring showing. The district livestock show. They have an open cattle class. He'll be ready." She said, "I don't have entry money." He said, "I'll front it. You can pay it back from the winnings." She said, "What if he doesn't win?" He said, "He'll win." He said it with the flat certainty of a man who does not hedge on things he has actually measured. January, February, the dark months, the months that press, the months when the land is silent under snow, and the only sounds are the cattle and the wind, and the close sounds of a house with two people in it who have stopped working to be unaware of each other. Marin had stopped jumping when she heard his boots on the stairs. He had stopped coming into the kitchen with the careful deliberateness of a man entering a space that belonged to someone else. These were small things. The size of small things was not always reliable. She found him one evening in February standing at the mantelpiece with his hand resting lightly on the frame of his wife's portrait, not moving, not doing anything, just standing the way a person stands in a doorway of a room they have not entered in a long time. She had come in from the barn. She stood for a moment in the doorway, snow still on her jacket, and then she turned and went back to the tack-room stairs, not because she was afraid of the sight, but because it was his. And some things need to be held alone before they can be held alongside. She found out later from Helga Brone, who delivered information, the way she delivered opinions without cushion, that the wife's name had been Clara, that she had died of an illness that started in the lungs and moved fast, the kind of illness that announces itself politely and then does not leave. That Aldrich had held the ranch together in the year after by working 18-hour days and not speaking to anyone he didn't have to. That Helga had brought him food every 3 days for the first 6 months and left it on the porch without knocking because she understood that some grief does not want a witness, only a supply line. Helga had looked at Marin when she finished saying this, the way Helga looked at things she had already made up her mind about, and said, "He's better with you here." Marin said, I'm not trying to." Helga said. I know what you're not trying to do. I said, he's better. I didn't say why that was your doing. It was the most comforting thing anyone had said to Maren in 2 years, and she thought about it for days afterward. At odd moments, the way a person turns a smooth stone in their pocket, not because they need it. March. The creek thawed. The sound of water returned to the eastern boundary. Soot had grown into something remarkable. 712 pounds at the beginning of March, 7 months old by the Count Maren, kept in her notebook, his chest a deep barrel, his neck carrying its mess with a composure that Aldrich said he had seen in maybe 3 animals in his life. The crooked foreleg had become simply the left foreleg. It bore his weight evenly. He moved through the south paddock with the unhurried confidence of an animal that has never doubted it is in the right place. The district spring showing was in the 3rd week of May. Aldrich began coaching Maren in February, not in showing technique exactly, since she already handled soot with more ease than most trained exhibitors, but in the language and the ritual of the show ring, the small performances expected of a handler, the way the judges moved, and what they looked at first and second and third. He coached her the way he did most things, plainly, concisely, without flattery, and with an absolute refusal to tell her something was correct when it was not. It was in the last week of March that Drevin found her. She had not thought he would not find her. She had known, somewhere beneath the daily reprieve of the ranch and the work and the slow building of a life that felt increasingly like hers, that the yet would eventually become now. She had simply allowed herself to live in the distance between. He appeared on a Thursday morning, arriving in a county vehicle he had acquired some purchase on county transportation, presumably through Rupert Cale or someone like him. And he stepped out of it in front of the Voss Creek gate, with a sheaf of papers under his arm, and his hair combed back and his expression of composed, patient authority fully assembled, the way a man assembles a costume when he knows he is being watched. Maren was in the paddock. She saw him from the paddock. She felt the particular cold that has nothing to do with weather move through her, and she stood very still for a moment, Soot's lead rope in her hand, the morning light flat and bright off the lingering snow, and then she walked steadily toward the gate. Aldrich was already there. He had seen the vehicle from the barn. Drevin addressed him first. Of course he did. He always established the hierarchy he preferred before speaking to the person he intended to diminish, and introduced himself as a concerned party with a legal interest in the welfare of an individual currently residing on the property. He used the word welfare the way it is sometimes used as a container for the implication of its opposite. He said he had documents pertaining to a contractual arrangement that had not been properly concluded. He said he hoped to resolve the matter quietly and without unpleasantness. He said this, looking at Maren, not at Aldrich. Aldrich said, "You can speak to her directly." Drevin said, of course, the smile. Maren, "I'm glad you're safe. I've been very worried." She said, "I know," he said, and he lowered his voice slightly, performing intimacy for an audience, that there were things they had left unresolved, that she had taken a position with obligations, that he was willing to be generous about the irregularity of her departure, if she would simply return and allow matters to be settled properly. She said, "What matters?" He said, "The arrangement, the contract your father signed." She said, "My father signed an employment contract for a household manager. I left that employment. I gave no notice. You can pursue damages for the notice period if you like." That's legal. She said it quietly. She said it the way she said most things, without display, without tremor. The rest of what you're implying isn't in that contract. It was never in any document. It only ever existed in what you told my family and what you told me. And none of that is actionable. He shifted. She saw it. Just barely, a micro-adjustment of posture. He moved back to expansive. Back to performance. He said he was also concerned about the nature of her current arrangement on this property, the suitability of the situation, the question of whether she was being properly. He searched for the word protected. Aldrich said, "She is employed here fairly at standard wage." "I can show the records," Drevin said, and now the volume went up slightly, the way it always went up when he felt the audience slipping. That he had connections to the county council. That the community had concerns about, and here he used the words that he had always used, the particular combination of polite and pointed, the encroachment of certain elements onto established land. The certain elements landed in the cold morning air and stayed there. Helga Braun's wagon was coming up the road. It stopped at the gate. Helga climbed down. She was carrying a tin, and she ignored Drevin entirely, and looked at Aldrich and said, "I brought preserves." Then she looked at Drevin, the way she looked at things she had already assessed, and she said, "You must be the man from the southern counties. Rupert Cale mentioned you'd be coming. I told the council recorder you'd be coming. I have his office's note if you'd like to see it." She produced a folded paper from her coat pocket, with the manner of a woman who has been carrying it there precisely for this moment. Drevin's assembled composure did not collapse. Men like him do not collapse, but it reorganized itself into something smaller and tighter. And the volume came down, and the performance of concerned benefactor began to show its seams. The county council had, as it turned out, been notified already. Aldrich had sent a letter in January. Marin had not known this. Through Rupert Cale's office, not to Rupert Cale himself, but to the records administrator above him, documenting Marin's employment, her wage, her residency, and flagging that her former employer had indicated intent to locate her, and that the nature of her previous arrangement had potentially coercive characteristics. He had attached a statement from a physician in the nearest town who had examined Marin at Aldrich's suggestion in November. She had agreed, not knowing exactly why he suggested it, trusting the absence of the catch, and whose clinical notes described evidence of prolonged stress-induced physical tension, documented weight deficiency relative to her age and frame, and several healed contusions consistent with occupational hazard in a high-demand domestic position. That was the neutral verifier's contribution. She had not framed it as accusation. She had simply described what she observed in the careful language of a woman of medicine, and it was in the council record. Drevin read the situation. He was a man who had always excelled at reading situations when they involved people with less leverage. He was somewhat less practiced at reading them when they involved documentation. He said, and this was the last performance, the most reduced, "I came with goodwill. I hope that is remembered." Marin said, "It is remembered. It is being documented. Good morning." He left. He walked to the county vehicle, and he got in, and he drove back down the road. And he did not look back. The narrator noted this, as Aldrich had predicted she would. Leaving without looking back was his one honest gesture. In the end, the first entirely true thing he had done in her presence, he was done. He did not attempt to dignify the knowledge. Helga opened her tin of preserves and said, "Well, now let's have coffee." They had coffee. Aldrich said almost nothing. Maren said almost nothing. Helga talked for all three of them, which was unusual for Helga, and they understood she was doing it to fill a space that needed filling, and they were both grateful. That evening, Maren sat on the porch steps alone, after the coffee and after the work. And after Helga had gone home, and she put her hands on her knees and she breathed out very slowly. She breathed out things she had been holding for 19 months, and some of them were older than 19 months, and she did not name all of them. She did not need to name all of them. They left anyway. Inside, through the window, she could see Aldrich at the kitchen table with his hands around a mug, and on the table beside him, where there had previously been only the ranch accounts and the feed invoices, there was a small flat stone she had left there a week ago, without thinking. It had come from the creek bed, the shape and color of a mussel shell, and she had picked it up because it pleased her, and put it on the table because it seemed like the right place for it. He had not moved it. He had simply continued doing his accounts with the stone sitting there on the table, and she had noticed this and said nothing. And he had noticed. This is what people mean when they say a thing grows like roots beneath soil. Not that it announces itself, not that it breaks the surface with any ceremony. Only that one day you look down and understand that something has been growing patiently through all the quiet days, and that it is strong. The district spring showing in the third week of May was held in the fairgrounds at the county seat, a cluster of buildings and open rings on the flat south side of town that smelled of trampled grass and machinery oil, and that particular sweet, heavy smell of cattle in proximity. There were 41 entries in the open Hereford class. Maren walked Soot in on a lead rope she had braided herself, from 3 lengths of good leather she had cut from a piece Aldrich kept in the tack room, not because she'd been told to, but because making the thing herself had felt right, because Soot was hers and the rope should be hers and the work should be hers. He walked beside her the way he always walked beside her, with the calm of an animal that trusts its person absolutely, his head at the correct angle, his steps even, the left foreleg placing itself with perfect steadiness. He was 9 months old. He weighed 941 pounds. He was, by any objective measure, the most fully realized animal in the ring. There were people at the ring who looked at Maren the way people had always looked at Maren. She had stopped expecting it to stop. She had started simply continuing anyway, which is a different kind of defiance. Quieter than protest, harder to argue with. The judges moved through the ring for 40 minutes. They came back to Soot 3 times. The third time they came back they stopped moving. Grand Champion Open Hereford class. First showing. Maren stood in the ring with the ribbon in her hand and Soot's lead rope in the other, and she thought, with some precision, about the $25. About the bidder's paddles that had not moved, about the asterisk on the auction sheet for a cosmetic defect, about the way value gets decided by people who are not always the most qualified to decide it, and about the way that occasionally, if you are patient and pay attention, the thing that nobody bid on turns out to be the thing worth having. She did not cry. She held the ribbon, and she let herself be still for a moment in the sun, and that was enough. The second Grand Championship was 2 years later, At the regional show where Soot stood against animals from 4 counties, and won with the kind of authority that does not require anyone to be surprised. By then his offspring were in 6 herds across the district. The bloodline had been noted formally in the regional breeding registry. The entry in the registry listed the animal's original purchaser as M. Voss, Voss Creek Ranch. She had not asked to use the name. He had included it in the registry paperwork without mentioning it. When she saw it, she looked at him across the kitchen table where she sat, and he sat with the ranch accounts between them, and he looked back and he said, "Unless you want it changed." She said no, and that was the proposal more or less. Neither of them needed more than that. They were married in June at the ranch, in the south paddock, in the early morning before the heat came up, with Helga Brohn and the physician from town and 2 neighbors from the western boundary in attendance, and Soot, grazing at the far end of the paddock as though the occasion were no particular business of his, which was correct. There was food afterward, and coffee, and the kind of conversation that happens between people who have nothing to perform for each other. On the mantelpiece, Clara's portrait still stood in its clean frame. Beside it now sat the flat creekstone, the color of a mussel shell, and beside that a length of braided leather, cut from the same piece as Soot's lead rope, looped into a coil and placed there without ceremony. Marin had put it there the morning of the wedding. She had not explained it, and Aldrich had not asked. He understood that it was not a replacement and not an erasure. He understood that she was making room the way a person makes room on a shelf for a new thing, not by removing what was there, but by moving gently along and finding that there was space enough, that there had always been space enough. On that morning, Marin stood at the kitchen window before the others arrived, her grandmother's whetstone in her hand, still wrapped in its cloth, and she sang very quietly a song her mother had known, the words mostly Marin's home language, the kind of song that is not about anything except being sung. She had not sung in just under 2 years. The voice that came out was uncertain at first, then steadier, then simply her own. Aldrich heard it from the porch. He stood without moving, coffee in his hands, listening. He did not want to stop it. Outside, the south paddock lay under the June light, and Soot moved through it, and the creek on the eastern boundary ran clear and cold, and the morning had the quality of a thing that is not beginning, but has already been growing, quietly, continuously, since before anyone thought to measure it. Some wounds close slowly, the way ground closes over a good root. Not to bury what was, but to give what comes next something real to hold on to.